The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'll ask you, Mr. Bailey, do you know why Alvin Bragg originally declined to move forward with the prosecution of Donald Trump?
I believe the reasonable inference to draw is that the charges aren't supported by the laws or the facts.
So let's talk about a guy named Mark Pomerantz. So Mark Pomerantz and his colleague, Mr. Dunn, resigned from the office because they felt that Mr. Bragg was not going to go forward with the case. And so he issued a statement. But in analysis, if you start looking at what Mr. Pomerantz said, he said, many members of the team did not think that they could prove Trump committed crimes. Many did not think the New York State criminal charges advanced by Pomerantz applied to Trump's conduct. In his book, he writes, many of the lawyers were relentlessly negative. There were references to our case as weak. One lawyer opined that it had many fatal flaws. Another expressed a view that the case may be way out there. It's not the strongest case in the world. If you go on, there were defectors from the Trump investigation. All of this is taking place from December of 2021 all the way through February of 2022. Now, why is that important? Because I want to get to this, Professor Foley, because there's a timeline issue, and you're talking about due process. And so due process is, you've mentioned two pillars, but I'm going to suggest that if you have an infirm prosecution and they're looking to find a way to prosecute because it's a person as opposed to the case. So here's the timeline, which may seem coincidental, but this is exactly what happened. November 7th, 2022, Trump teases. He says, I have a big announcement coming up. September 9th, 2022, at a press conference, Joe Biden says, we just have to demonstrate that he will not take power if he does run, making sure he, under legitimate efforts of our Constitution, does not become the next president. On November 15th, Trump announces his run. Now, here's where it gets interesting. On November 18th, Matthew Colangelo, number 3 in the DOJ, resigns. He gives a 2-week notice in a letter, and he's going to end up quitting his job at DOJ on December 2nd. He's going to work for Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg's office beginning December 5th. And nobody can tell us from DOJ or Alvin Bragg how they even, nobody seems to know. He just apparently, Colangelo just shows up in the office one day. Point 2 on that same date, November 18th, Merrick Garland appoints Jack Smith on 2 cases against Trump, one in Florida and one in Washington, D.C. Number 3, same day, November 18th, Fannie Willis's paramour, Nathan Wade, spends 8 hours in meetings with White House lawyers. And it wasn't too long after that indictments start falling into place. And we could go through those. I wanted to ask you, Ms. Foley, if a prosecutorial agency is actually searching for crimes because of an individual, and they've stated it. Don't forget Mr. Bragg, and I'm leaving out all of his campaign promises to get Trump. Couldn't name any kind of thing that he had done wrong, but he's going to get Trump. Is that antithetical to the very notion of due process in and of itself?
Yeah, you ask a really interesting question. Yes, the short answer is yes. There is a line of Supreme Court jurisprudence beginning with a case called Rochin versus California in the 1960s, which establishes what's called the shocks the conscience test for violation of due process. You may remember that from law school. It's where your stomach got pumped forcibly against his will.
Yeah.
But since Rochin was decided, there have been other Supreme Court cases. There's one called X-Rel Vuitton. There's one called Caperton involving judges. And this line of jurisprudence under due process says that if you can establish that there was bias by a prosecutor, an investigator, or a judge that shocks the conscience, it's a due process violation as well.
Right, so when we start looking at this, and you realize that there was no theory of the case that seemed to work. I mean, that's from Mr. Pomerantz's testimony. They couldn't come up with a case. You have prosecutors saying, we can't find anything here. And then all of a sudden you get jury instructions like you have here. How antithetical to that is to due process?
Well, I think when you piece all those pieces of evidence together, they paint a pretty compelling picture of bias. And, whether or not it would shock, the left side of the aisle's conscience, I don't know, but it certainly would shock mine. I'm trying to be pretty objective about this. It's a high bar to shock someone's conscience, but, basically the idea is, if you're doing the Attorney General Justice Jackson maneuver of picking the man and pinning some crime on him, then yes, I would hope that would shock your conscience.
Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back.